Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome to Lake Erie Regional Grape Programs podcast series. I'm Jennifer Phillips-Russo, the Viticulture Extension Specialist, and with me is Kevin Martin, the Business Management Specialist. And today we're here to talk about...
Unfortunately, more labor issues. So on January 1st, there were going to be some changes made. There were some changes made to how agricultural labor is regulated in New York State. I think probably anybody who listens to this podcast knew that. We had some trainings on it. Cornell has had some trainings on it, and in conjunction with Farm Bureau and Farm Credit. I think we've tried to do our best to inform everyone of those regulatory changes. There was a temporary restraining order on January 1st, which if you've read the newspaper, you've probably heard about. But if you haven't, you certainly could have missed it. So some elements of that law will not go into effect. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and what hasn't changed since January 1st.
I do have a question.
Sure.
If I am not up on all of the labor issues, is there a place I can go besides missing the newspaper? Is there a website?
So, I mean, honestly, right now, for some of these issues, it really is important to stay current because things are changing so fast. Like a temporary restraining order, we know what we know because it just happened. But Cornell has some good resources through their workforce development page. And our crop update obviously includes links to that information and also includes summaries of these regulatory changes as well. We did have an event on the 23rd of December for the information as we knew it on the 23rd. So going forward, we'll do our best through this podcast and through our normal ways of contacting you about updates. So this temporary restraining order will end on January 24th. So what that means is there may be some sort of settlement before the 24th, or there might be a preliminary injunction hearing on the 24th, which will basically mean that the TRO will be extended beyond that date, or it won't, depending on the results of that hearing. So what I mean to say is we really don't know what will happen after the 24th.
Okay, I'm sorry. I want you to please talk to me like I'm 4. I have no idea what the restraining order is for. It just sounds
Right.
like you're going to hurt me.
Right. So, like I said, there were elements of the law that they're concerned about the legality of implementing it. So the New York State Vegetable Association and the Northwest Dairy Producers Association sued New York State, and they successfully obtained a temporary restraining order on part of the law. That's mostly focused on what a hourly employee is going to be. So this law did not follow the standards of the Fair Labor Standards Act. It did not just simply apply those federal rules to agricultural workers. It took a new direction that was partially guided by fair labor standards. It opened up the possibility of unions to farm laborers. But by and large, agricultural workers are still completely exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act directly. But they are subject to this New York State law. What those organizations were concerned about is they eliminated exemptions for executive, administrative, and professional employees. Basically, they eliminated almost all salaried employees. Okay. And that created some challenges for trying to figure out what people acting as managers could do when a union was trying to be formed. That's all fairly clear cut in the federal system, and this law led to some ambiguous situations where that was concerning. What I'm sure New York State was trying to do was to limit exemptions for overtime pay. Those exemptions will not be limited until at least January 24th for these executive and administrative and professional classified employees.
So if I'm a grower and I have a manager and then I have a salaried employee and I also have hourly or piece rate employees, what do I do changing as of right now? What should I be doing differently?
So farmers never had to understand what the qualifications were for executive, administrative, and professional staff. Okay. All of their employees were exempt from overtime pay. So even with this temporary restraining order, they're brought in line with the rest of the workforce, which means they have to understand what an executive employee is or what an administrative employee is if they want to qualify for an overtime exemption. So they could proceed as usual, pay somebody hourly, and make sure they pay overtime pay. They could do that, or they could classify some of their employees, at least until January 24th, as executive, administrative, or professional, if they qualify. So there's quite a long test to try to determine whether or not they would qualify. One of the big things that might help growers make their decision is that there is a minimum salary that has to be paid. And in New York State, it's different than the rest of the country. So for executive and administrative professionals, they have to be paid $885 per week.
Can I interrupt you for
Sure.
a second? Those are the only ones that then can be considered salaried, so they don't have to be paid overtime.
Correct.
And that minimum is what again? 800?
So for executive and administrative staff, it's $885.
Okay.
For professionals, that actually is not regulated by New York State. It's regulated by the federal government, and it was just raised January 1st to $684 per week. So those were significant changes on the professional side and on the federal side, increasing that, I guess I'll call it a minimum salary to qualify. So there will be a lot of people who no longer qualify for these exemptions and will be required to track hours and pay overtime. If you have employees that are above this minimum salary requirement, there are primary duties that they must complete. They must have the right type of job to qualify as well. But I do believe that the minimum salary requirement will eliminate most of our employees. So most people will now be hourly, subject to overtime because they're not paid enough to qualify for these exemptions.
Is there a listing for the ones who are qualified of those the job description that has to meet?
Yes, basically what you're looking at, and you see this in the private sector or the public sector, for typical employees, you're really looking for somebody they have responsibilities that are fairly independent. They either have an advanced knowledge of something, so typically a degree or a long apprenticeship. If they don't have a license, it's going to be more difficult for them to be classified as a professional exemption. Executives are going to be responsible for people.
Okay.
So if they don't have the ability to hire or fire somebody, they're certainly not going to be an executive. Administrative people basically have to work inside. If they're not doing business operations, and nowadays basically on a computer or maybe you still use a ledger, they're not going to be an administrative staff person. Enforcement of these kind of laws are fairly lenient. And the private sector has been very aggressive in overclassifying people in an exempt status. Farmers are more than welcome to do that. I'm not going to predict how closely regulated it's going to be, but certainly when there is a dispute between an employee and an employer, it will be looked at fairly closely. Outside of those disputes, I think enforcement is a little bit more questionable, but certainly I think that's why they've implemented this minimum salary as a meaningful number that actually excludes a lot of people who used to be considered exempt, because that creates a bright line test for qualifying. It's very easy to see if someone makes $832 a week or not. It's a little bit more difficult to see what the primary duties of that person are and what kind of discretion they exercise on a day in and day out basis. So we definitely want to make sure you're paying that $832 or $684 a week if you're taking advantage of this. It's something that's somewhat complicated to understand, and it may all be irrelevant by January 24th. So it's up to you to decide if you want to take advantage of it for the next couple of weeks.
So if I do,
Mm-hmm.
what's a number? Do I call the Cornell Labor Department?
Yeah, if you have questions, you can certainly contact us and we can do our best to help. But to really have an understanding of whether or not you're in compliance, you should probably contact your attorney if you don't understand the laws. I'm definitely recommending that most most farmers transition to custom payroll services so that they're paying somebody to do the payroll for them, and they should be able to help with some of these issues. But again, if it really does get into a gray area, the advice is going to have to come from an attorney.
Oh, good advice. Thank you. So if you have any further questions about any of this, please feel free to call Kevin or talk to your attorney like he suggested, or also look at all of the resources that we have in the crop update and on the website.
And the only other thing I would note is this temporary restraining order doesn't impact any other parts of the law. So if you know that this person is an hourly person, they will still be subject to the new overtime requirements. All the insurances that are now required, whether it's paid family leave, those remain a requirement. So if you've gotten those all set up, I guess the good news is while you still have to pay for them and administer them, that requirement has not gone away. So nothing has changed there, and it does not look like anything will change there. It just may be that there are new exemptions for certain types of employees. I guess we'll find out in the months to come.
And when we find out, how is all that information sent out to everybody? Is it just going through our crop update again? Will it usually through the newspaper? When is that released on the 24th? Where do we look for it?
So it will depend on when the court releases information, but certainly we will continue to keep you apprised through this video podcast and through our crop update. Farm Bureau has been outspoken about it, so has Farm Credit. If you work with Farm Credit to do payroll, I'm sure they'll keep you informed. There are a lot of different avenues to finding this information. The one challenge is that some of these things are happening so quickly that you may not necessarily find it in time. So for example, if you had to do payroll on January 2nd, you had about 24 hours to figure this out, theoretically. So
stay tuned for the latest information to our podcast.
I mean, the good news is it's not harvest season, so we're not trying to figure this out when we have a large amount of overtime happening, but it is definitely a challenge. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us or either down below or give us a call. Thank you.
Thank you.